Good morning, everyone. You might notice I'm not Alan Giacomo, who's on the program. He had a family issue and couldn't come, so I'm substituting. I'm Don Gibbons. I'm the Senior Science and Education and Communication Officer at CIRM, the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. So I hope I'll do a decent substitute for what Alan has generally called a conversation on the intersection between science and technology and public policy and ethics. And so we're going to hit on some topics. And if you have a topic you want to discuss, absolutely bring it up, raise your hand and say, what do you think about X, Y, or Z? And we've got three very divergent people that will try to discuss it for you and hopefully add some insight. So beginning on my closest here, Jeanne is from the Scripps Research Institute in San Diego. She's a professor of developmental neurobiology and director of their Center for Regenerative Medicine. And next to her is Beth Roxland, who is started a new position about a year and a half ago? 2 years ago, okay. With Johnson & Johnson. She's the bioethics and strategy leader reporting directly into the CMO, the Chief Medical Officer. I think that's really important for a company that size to have someone like Beth in that position, and I'm really glad that she was able to create that role. It's a new role, and she's creating it, and I think it should be an interesting precedent. One of the things that she has there is the Bioethics Center of Excellence, where they give advice on things like compassionate use, trial design, and things that the patient advocacy community really cares about. And last on our group is Levine, an associate professor in the School of Public Policy at Georgia Tech. Really researches the intersection of public policy and biomedical research. We love Aaron because he's written a number of stories documenting the impact of state funding. So CIRM has been a major character in some of his research papers, so thank you, Aaron. With that, I want to join the panel and just... Could you introduce yourself? But I'm going to start with something that is rolling around the states, and that's the right to try laws. And how this group sees that fitting in with kind of safety, efficacy, patient rights. And I'm going to ask them to, actually I'll come back to that second question. So Aaron, why don't you start out?
Are these all on?
They're all on, yes.
Well, I appreciate the heads up. Let me think about right to try here for a second.
Tell them what it is.
So what right to try is, I mean, there's a number of different variants, and Beth is probably even more of an expert on this, but this is a series of laws that have been passed in close to half of the states now, if not even more, 24, so close to half, that are designed to give patients access, or at least give the appearance of giving patients access to experimental medications that are early in the clinical trial pipeline. So usually the law, I think, is giving patients sort of a pathway to request those medications directly from biotech or pharmaceutical companies for things that have approved phase 1 but have not made it through the full process. They're, from my perspective as a policy scholar, sort of awkward laws in a lot of ways, because the FDA is actually a federal agency. These are almost exclusively state laws, and in most cases, the state laws would probably be preempted by FDA federal law if we'd actually got to that point. So in a lot of ways, it seems like they might actually be more symbolic than practical. But they do, I think, fit into a broader narrative of patient advocacy and patient influence in the regulatory system and in the research funding system that I think is interesting for us to think about, and so we can talk about the different ways patients are advocating for access to medicines, and there are, of course, FDA parallels, not identical, but things that we heard about yesterday morning in the speech by some of the FDA representatives about early access and accelerated access and those sorts of models that have some similarities as well.
Beth, you follow this more closely sometimes. Are any court cases in process, or is it still just too early?
I don't think it's actually either too early or that there are none. I don't know that there will be any. As Aaron said, the Right to Try movement is a U.S. state level movement to try to provide patients with faster access to experimental therapies. Some of the laws are very specific to drugs, but a lot of them cover drugs, biologics, and devices. So to the extent that this is drugs, it might not affect people so much in this room, but most of the laws are actually for all three. Almost every state law, in fact, I think every state law says a patient should be able to have access after phase 1 safety studies, despite whether there's ongoing placebo-controlled clinical trials. In phase 2, you, terminal patient, have the right to save your own life, and by having this right, you have the right to request from the manufacturer access to the drug. It does not explicitly mention the FDA, but the clear import is that you have access, no mention of the FDA, therefore, actually, I should say before anything else, I am not speaking on behalf of my employer. This is not J&J, this is just me. It might be representing NYU, but not J&J. And so you should have access to this experimental therapy. Problem is, if you look at the actual text of these laws, and this is true of every single one of the laws, is that it only says that you have the right to ask for the drug. And so it is, first of all, a right that everybody already has under federal law. And the answer and why that's important is that if it actually gave you if it mandated manufacturers' provision, then you would actually have a right. This is your right does not exist unless anybody is required to actually recognize that you have this right, and this does not mandate anything. If it mandated something, I think the legal scholars would say, then you're in the preemption range. But since it doesn't say anything and doesn't give you anything, the FDA doesn't necessarily have an interest in, taking this for any kind of adjudication as to its validity, because it doesn't do anything.
So in some states, I know the unregulated stem cell clinics that are kind of using adipose tissue for everything are using these laws as a shield to operate. Jeanne, I know you've looked at that.
Yeah, that was my main concern, because technically, and I haven't read the laws, I probably should. If there is a requirement for an actual phase 1 FDA trial, then it shouldn't make any difference. But in the case of the stem cell clinics that are using adipose tissue as a therapy or they're offering as a therapy for just about every disease imaginable, I'm sure that they will take advantage of this opportunity, or these laws, to say that in fact this gives them the right to offer these therapies to patients and they pay for them directly, because it's completely separated from the insurance industry. I think it's interesting about the recent Japanese regulations that seem to be a little somewhat in the same area as this, that in Japan the stem cell therapies are probably going to be offered after a phase 1 safety trial without the requirement for a secondary for the other phases to be completed. And that's uniquely Japanese. That is not happening in the United States. But I think it's something to think about, because they're going to be doing this experiment, and I think we could learn a great deal from it.
I saw a gentleman walk in from Texas who would talk to me in the hall about good ways of doing these laws and bad ways. Would you be willing to stand up and point out what you see as kind of a bad point when it's not done right? So Beth, go ahead.
Yeah, just a couple things. So one of the things that you said is that your version of the bill, because this is in fact a funded effort out of this institute called the Goldwater Institute based in Arizona, a lot of these bills are almost identical. Some of the legislatures now are getting a little bit more into the text and changing some stuff around, but certainly like the first wave of states, their bills all look exactly the same, and the later bills only have a tinker here or there. They do allow charging if the clinic, the physician, whomever would like to. One important point, and I don't know if it's in the Texas has had a lot of legislative activity in compassionate use altogether, not just in right to try, but that there is an insulation from liability for the manufacturer so that you cannot bring a private right of action in virtually all of these bills, and you cannot, and this physician cannot lose their license. They can't be sanctioned by their state licensure board. So if we're talking about a stem cell clinic, there's a lot of, it's in the sort of the Wild West of stem cell, it's actually a lot more, the collateral damage out of this effort is much greater than in the usual context.
So questions about this topic? Go ahead. So you're saying it's really more cosmetic than anything else? Or ego sabbing, yes.
Sorry. So I think there is some evidence on the stem cell side that for-profit clinics have popped up in states that have done this. I can't speak to that they've popped up necessarily with data that, because the state passed these laws. On the stem cell side, there might have been activity due to these laws, and I personally think there probably was. On the side of, let's say, the straight pharmaceuticals, again, there actually is no right provided in that law. So the Goldwater Institute has actually said on a number of occasions they know of a few grants of compassionate use under right to try. The thing is, you could give it to a patient under right to try and still have gone through the FDA's processes as well. It doesn't necessarily mean that you bypass the FDA. They like to say the law bypasses the FDA, but as far as I know, not one of the bills in any of the 24 states or the pending states actually say the word FDA.
I mean, there's a number of different issues you've raised. I do think, I mean, one, almost any legitimate company that is going to ultimately want an FDA-approved product has almost no incentive to try to use these laws, even if they could, as cover to bypass them. They really can't, but they could claim cover. Where you do see a possible risk, and I think part of the motivation for discussing here, is these stem cell clinics operating in a little bit of that FDA gray area where it's an autologous type intervention where they might at least claim to be outside of pre-market approval pathways at the FDA. And of course, we've heard debates about that. Jeanne asked a question yesterday, and the FDA said, let us know. We all know when you let the FDA know, it doesn't necessarily translate into rapid action towards some of these clinics, and there's good reason, there are reasons for that. But that's the area where I think there is some degree of risk. I don't think necessarily these laws open the door to that much more than they did in the past. I mean, if you were going to ignore the FDA, you could operate in Georgia or California or wherever you feel like, and if the FDA comes calling, you move, you shut down. I mean, this is the model that most of these clinics or whatever we want to call them have adopted. It might be that you get a little bit of cover from a state right to try law. There's other options. Texas was an interesting example. Several years ago, passed and I'm going to blank on the exact name, but it was sort of a unproven stem cells under IRB approval through the Texas Medical Board, which also gave a little bit of that cover for things that weren't not under FDA jurisdiction or were questionable under FDA jurisdiction. And FDA keeps on clarifying their rules to eliminate that to some degree, but it still is an open case. But I do think the big point is that most companies that need to work with the FDA eventually have no incentive to do this. There are the cost issues and the stock, and that for some companies that's a real big issue. For others, it's not that relevant, but it depends on what they're producing.
Aaron, you brought up an issue that I wanted to address, which was, I was surprised how openly Celia Whitten yesterday from the FDA said, call us and tell us and we will take action. Whether she, don't choke on your coffee, but she openly invited people to call and said that they don't have the staff to go out and police on their own, but they will act upon a call. Yeah. Jeanne, do you intend to make the call?
Yes. Yes, I intend to make a call, probably more than one call. Thank you. So we've been thinking about how to, I mean, I've tried to help the FBI when they ask. I've helped the Medical Licensing Board when they ask to try to intercede with particularly egregious therapies that actually harm people, or that I mean, there was a doctor who brought a patient from somewhere, he was in San Diego, he brought a patient from somewhere in the South in an RV and took him across the border so he could get a stem cell therapy. He was terminally ill. And there was a doctor in San Diego that saw him and refused to let him be transported any further. And his family sued the doctor in San Diego. But it turned out okay. The guy who runs this clinic lost his medical license. The question is whether it makes any difference. I mean, I don't think it'll make any difference to him whether he has a medical license or not. He'll keep doing this because it's profitable. So we've been trying to think of ways, and so I've also learned that the FDA, besides the FDA not being very helpful, the FBI doesn't have the bandwidth either. They're too busy looking at Medicare fraud, which fills their days. And the Medical License Bureau will occasionally take action when it's really obviously terrible and somebody has been harmed. What I've been thinking about is something like the cancer quackery law in California, which came up as a result of the Laetrile scandal. And it actually gave California the teeth to prosecute people who were deliberately misleading patients by offering them this cancer treatment which did nothing and in fact harmed people. I think a law like that, which is certainly feasible, that would be focused on stem cell therapies that don't work, that take advantage of patients, might be an option and might be feasible in California.
What do you think, Erin? You're the public policy expert.
Yeah.
I have to admit I'm not an expert on the cancer quackery law, although I made a note to look it up. But I mean, this echoes a comment I made yesterday. There are possibilities at the state level for regulation and for legal intervention. It is a little tricky because a lot of medical interventions are done at the federal level, right? So you have to worry about how those connections work out. But medical practice is a state level activity, and certainly states could pass regulation that might have some effect on this. And how you tell if something really is, what the qualifications are to be, applicable under these sorts of laws is difficult, but something that could be done, and I would certainly be interested in exploring it. California's a big state, but it's got a lot of borders. You can go to Nevada, you can go to Oregon. I mean, it's ultimately probably of limited impact. I mean, what we've seen in cases where the FDA shuts people down, you go to Mexico, right? You drive across the border, or you go to the Caribbean, you go to all sorts of other places. So the problem is always going to exist, but a series of those sorts of laws could be a step forward.
Yeah, a lot of little things.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are a lot of different tacks that can be taken to think about addressing unproven stem cells, and one is, sort of trying to adopt appropriate legislation. One is trying to encourage the FDA or other regulatory bodies to step in, and the FDA has in a few cases. It was nice for them to encourage people to write in. They don't have the compliance staff to do this. They have to pick and choose their cases. And they have some strategy about what they do, when they do, those sorts of things, which I think is probably not enough for a lot of people in this room. But I think there's actually a lot that patients could do as well. I think there's a lot to be said for patients actually interact with these clinics much more than scientists, much more than the FDA, and some open, sort of transparent, information, the information patients learn from these clinics, I think would be very valuable if it was shared more widely. I'm not necessarily sort of registries of how the outcomes work, but a lot of the sort of information about what goes on in the negotiation discussion process I think could be valuable, which without legislation.
Thank you, and you led into what I wanted to use as a transition to another topic. Before I do that, I do want to echo that, above and beyond any laws and regulations, I think the biggest thing that could help is that everyone in this room that understands the issue, take it upon yourselves to tell friends, family, whatever, about the issues around unregulated stem cell clinics, and tell them, if you're thinking of going there, I spend about an hour a day on the phone talking to desperate patients and their family members. And I could, in my sleep, say, ask them for data. If they don't have data, don't go. Ask them if they're collecting data, and more important, are they sharing data with the community? Because they're not doing that, all they care about is your wallet. And then usually they'll go, oh, okay, that makes sense. So anybody in this room can say those same words or something like it, and I think that's how we can make a difference in transparency a little bit, because if people start demanding transparency from these clinics, it might create a little crack and start to happen occasionally. So with that, I'm going to go into kind of what, in ethics and public policy debate is an 800-pound gorilla we've ignored, which is fetal tissue. In stem cell research, if you're looking at neurobiology issues, virtually everything being used comes from fetal tissue and has for decades. There have been a few really good articles explaining that to the public, but it hasn't sunk in. I'm wondering from the three of you, what do you think we can do or should do to, one, make that case, and two, is there some policy thing we can do to kind of cement the value of that research?
Yeah, so just to give you more background on this, there were neural stem cells from fetal tissue that were being used for possible treatments for a lot of diseases long before there were embryonic stem cells. And there are some advantages to using fetal neural cells for delivery delivery of genes to the brain. I mean, they aren't being used to repair anything. They're essentially being used to deliver things. So there have been actually successful clinical trials on orphan diseases using transplants of fetal neural stem cells. So that kind of thing has to stay, I think. I don't know how to, I mean, I like to fight fire with fire when I can, but I can't imagine doing a video like the one on Planned Parenthood that somehow lets people know how valuable fetal tissue is. I think that would be challenging, although you can try. But I think, again, after, what it comes down to is again, telling the public that we need X in order to treat Y. And this is the treatment that is most likely to work. And you know, my argument back when people were making embryonic stem cells was that these are tissues that are going to be thrown away anyway. So they have two possible fates. One is the garbage can, and the other one is the hands of a research scientist. So what would you prefer to have happen? Sometimes that has a bit of impact, sometimes it doesn't.
So, Erin, Beth, yeah.
Actually, I just wanted to stop and take a step back and actually ask, since our audience isn't necessarily all U.S., nor do they necessarily follow politics, does everyone out here know why fetal tissue is an issue at the moment? Raise your hand if you know why we're talking about fetal tissue. So worthy of a little bit of background.
Raise your hand. If you know, raise your hand.
So I'm going to try to give you the most vanilla version that I possibly can. I am taking no position myself, but there was a video taken allegedly of a Planned Parenthood representative. It's been brought up in the Republican debates quite a bit, but a video allegedly showing a Planned Parenthood representative talking about money changing hands for fetal tissue and potentially changing the techniques for an abortion in order to use the tissue to sort of preserve the tissue in the best way for research.
Correct, yeah.
And it was then brought up, first of all, it was in itself like a sort of a big media story, then was brought up in the Republican debates and has now come up a couple of times since then in various sort of political circles. So there's now a lot of talk about whether or not we should be using fetal tissue. Where did you get the fetal tissue? Did you purposely have an abortion or get paid so that the fetal tissue could go to research or what have you? So I think in answer to Dawn, I'm not sure personally that it's about talking about how much value there is in the science, 3 steps down the road. I think the things that have to come across, even though they're already in the laws for the most part, there is separation of a decision between having the termination of a pregnancy and a decision to donate the tissue for research, whether or not there was payment either to the donor or to the clinic, and was the payment to the clinic anything above and beyond reimbursement for storage costs? Were you paying the clinic? There's almost more of an inducement issue, I think, in the fetal tissue area when we're talking about payments to a clinic, because the clinics here a lot of times also intervene on the patient directly. And so the payment to the clinic has to be very clean hands, and I'm not implying that it was not. I just think these are things that have to come in addition to saying the science that you might derive once you get the tissue is very valuable.
I'm going to give it to you in a second. One thing these videos taught me was that I should always assume that I'm being secretly filmed. So, yeah, I mean, they're doing it publicly right now, and I'm being very careful. But even in my office, when I'm talking to the people in my lab, I am very careful to make sure that I don't throw out these stupid things about that devalue the tissue and the cells and everything that we work with, because this is the essence of our research. These cells are very important to us, whether they're fetal or iPS cells or ES cells. We couldn't do any of this stuff without them. So I think we need to just be careful. We need to think we're being filmed all the time. We just need to be careful and not be flippant about the work we do. It's serious stuff, and people care about it, and we should care about it too.
I think Jeanne makes an important point. Anyone who talks publicly or even privately about these issues needs to think about. I mean, I think there's 2 points here. One, just to reiterate what Beth said, much of this debate, although the discussion is about fetal tissue research, is really about the politics, maybe the ethics, but primarily the politics of pregnancy termination. These videos were taken, at least in part, to play into that political debate. What Beth said about the law is completely true, though. This is, from an ethics perspective, the use of fetal tissue is, again, I said this yesterday, the topic of yesterday had been discussed for years. This has been discussed for decades as well. There are laws on the books enforcing basically everything Beth said. So there is complete separation, or there should be if all the laws are followed, of the decision to terminate versus the donation to research. There is no it's not permitted to be compensated, certainly for the woman who terminates a pregnancy, nor for the clinic or facility that donates the tissue beyond reimbursement for expenses. So all of this is there. The videos raise some questions about that for a variety of reasons. There is, I think, another point that Dawn led to, that there is a case for an affirmative justification of this research. And so NIH, that funds a lot of this research, CIRM, that presumably funds some of this research, I think has a duty to justify the importance of fetal tissue research. And it's actually not a hard case to make. There's a lot of very important advancements and very important ongoing research that uses fetal tissue. So I think that case should be made to factor into this as well. So I was reading an article just yesterday talking about the NIH funding portfolio, and I think it was in a relatively recent year they funded somewhere on the order of 150, 170 grants that used fresh fetal tissue. So this is above and beyond the hundreds of projects that use cell lines derived from fetal tissue in the past, and that research has been phenomenally important. But this is fresh fetal tissue, so going through this sort of donation process and showing the wide range of conditions. So a lot of this was for infectious disease work, a lot of HIV work uses this sort of tissue, but a lot of conditions you might not initially think of. So a lot of research on eye diseases uses this tissue, and there's a lot of different uses for it. So one is what Jeanne mentioned, and the derivation of some sort of stem cells derived from fetal tissue, often neural stem cells, and there are active clinical trials in this, but there's other uses for this tissue to, for instance, create humanized mice that then are used to test HIV interventions and different things like that. So there is a lot of important research that can be actively justified. Now, this is a challenging area. One of the interesting things about this and similar articles is the journalists often try to talk to the scientists, and usually you have a statement, we contacted 26 scientists, none would comment on the record, or one would comment on the record, and scientists, I think, are scared and have some good reason to be scared. In many cases, the institutions won't even let the scientists comment on the record. There was one from University of Texas that says, to protect our scientists, we will not let them speak with you. Right? So there is a very, almost, I don't know what the right word is, but an atmosphere of perhaps even justified fear, but of caution here that pervades this whole discussion in the United States and makes this a very difficult area.
So, you know,
Just a couple comments. Yep. So I was the 27th scientist. I was the one who was willing to comment. But we were talking about all the things that these cells are used for, and I don't know if all of you are aware that Ben Carson, who's one of our Republican candidates for president, has actually published a paper using fetal tissue to study a cyst in the brains of patients. So he's on record. He has a publication using fetal tissue. So that might be an interesting thing to bring up sometime, depending on the circumstances, that people, I mean, this is something that is regularly used, including by our Republican candidates for president. So
I agree with Beth that the technical issues around the policy issue in this debate are those issues of when the consent happens between the termination of the pregnancy and the research donation, and verifying the transparency of the only reimbursement is for cost. But that's the technical side. I think to kind of have any impact on the public, you've got to go to the same emotional spot that the videotape went, and the only way to do this is to talk about, you know, an ALS patient walking again, that type of thing. I'm going to put you on the spot, Victoria. Nebraska has on a drafted piece of legislation that could do great damage to the state. In your state, which do you think would have a greater impact? Clarifying the inaccuracies in the video in terms of technically, you know, consent and et cetera, or the emotional outcome of in your case, Parkinson's research? Right. Yeah. University of Washington has a long-term contract with NIH to procure the tissue, and are the source for many researchers. Does anybody else in the room have comments or questions about this particular topic?
Actually, I wanted to add just one thing, actually, and I guess it's already implicit that one of the activities going on in the wake of the video or the discussion are a number of states that are considering laws. So I think that's the part that we didn't talk about. There are a number of states that already had laws on the books limiting fetal tissue research in some manner or form, either an outright ban, this predating the recent activities, or some forms of restrictions, either on payment or otherwise. So there were some laws on the books, but there's about 4 or 6 states that are now actively, at least in their legislature, looking at, again, different kinds of bills. They're not all the same. This is not, again, this is not like Right to Try, where everything looks exactly the same with small changes. Some of them, again, go to outright bans on all research done in the state on fetal tissue or cells derived therefrom. Others just go to the monetary issues.
So, are there any hot topics people want to address? Go ahead. Well, it's always a balancing act of hope versus hype. And everybody in all the different communities around this research, patients themselves, vary on where they draw that line in terms of willing to have hope, or, you know, the risk is too great. And that's got to be a constant discussion, because that line is flexible, and we need to listen to the groups. I mean, you mentioned the HIV activists. They clearly saw the line as different from what was the norm, but yet they also saw risks. My husband was a clinical trial coordinator for the AZT trial at Surgeon General, and he got a lot of grief that you're killing us with AZT, but it became the first drug approved for the HIV. So, you know, it's not black and white.
I did want to reiterate, I think the hope versus hype issue is important, and I wanted to mention that earlier because there has been a narrative, sorry, is this me, of hype associated with fetal tissue research. A lot of people will say, oh, there was a big hype period and it hasn't lived up, we should move on. That's sort of a narrative you sometimes hear. I think that's a mistake in some ways. I mean, but there was a period where there was a little bit of overhype. But I liked your point. I mean, it strikes me, in the early days of embryonic stem cell research, there was a much more concerted effort from the scientific community to have a coordinated, concerted message. And that has not been the case, at least recently, in fetal tissue. I suspect it's because it's an even higher profile. It's a harder topic to be out in front on for a variety of reasons, at least in the U.S. context. And it's sort of interesting from an ethics point of view. Fetal tissue research is actually not as problematic as embryonic stem cells for many people, but from a public perception point of view, it's very different, and it's hard to, the meeting where all the medical advocacy groups get together to plan their message on fetal tissue is going to be a very awkward meeting that no one really wants to have, right? And so there's reasons that message is not as consistent.
So let me clarify that a little bit for folks in the room that are not as attuned. Somatic cell nuclear transfer, SCNT, can be used to clone tissue, as it was with Dolly, but it can also be used to potentially make cells that match a patient. And so that great potential is something that people did not want to have banned, because having cells that would match your immune system were almost a holy grail for our field. And it took a lot of work to avoid those bans. So what do you think about the analogies there?
Yeah, you want to both talk at once? You want to get both lines? I'll start, and I'll be brief. I think in every one of these cases, including the AIDS, including IVF, which was also freaked people out when it was first Louise Brown was born, and embryonic stem cells. I mean, I'm old enough that I've seen a lot of these things happen. And I think in every single case, the solution was education. And I don't know how the way that you deliver information has changed. So I think what we need to do now is to use the methods that people use to deliver information, that is the internet, social media, to deliver that message. And I'm not the right person to ask. I think maybe Aaron is.
Did you want to intervene, or no? This is a complicated question. So I think certainly we want to draw lessons from past debates for current debates. SCNT was a complicated one, so that when it was brought up yesterday, I think part of the point was the cloning of Dolly took even much of the scientific community by surprise. The irony is it actually shouldn't have taken the scientific community by surprise. Dolly was not even really the first mammal cloned in agricultural science. They had already essentially cloned not from an adult cell, but from an embryonic cell a couple of years before, and it just was the isolation of the molecular biology community, which was much more engaged in these areas, versus the agricultural science community, that this wasn't even really well known. So even within the scientific community, it took people by surprise, and then it reverberated out into the public dramatically and sort of in a lot of unfortunate ways. Lots of bills proposed. The good thing, it's very easy to propose bills, so there's lots of fetal tissue bills out there. Thankfully, most of those, the vast majority of all bills, no judgment on any individual bill, doesn't become law. In Georgia, there'll be hundreds of bills dropped in the state legislature this year, and only a handful of them will actually get adopted and signed by the governor, right? So a lot of these laws, there is a chance for education about the specific impacts. There were bills early in the aftermath of the cloning of Dolly that would have banned molecular cloning techniques that are commonplace in hundreds of biology labs around the country, right? And so there are opportunities there. The SCNT debates in particular were really, at the federal level, it was really, the reason there was never a ban was a group of senators, essentially, that were not willing to see that. And in the Senate, a minority can prevent these things from becoming law, essentially. And it was a debate between banning reproductive cloning, which interestingly enough has never been banned legislatively in the United States, versus all somatic cell nuclear transfer, including what Dawn was talking about, cloning to create patient-matched cell lines. And so, that big dick requires only federal funding. That's just, so, there are a lot of states that have banned somatic cell nuclear transfer for all purposes. So some states, California, for instance, banned reproductive cloning, but not somatic cell nuclear transfer. They have a bunch of other rules that complicate, acquiring the raw materials to actually do this research, which is a different strategy. But there are a lot of states that made full bans. And so you get different policies at the state level, and we'll see that in fetal tissue, we'll see that in a variety of other areas. Now, what can we learn from that history? I mean, in some ways, fetal tissue predates all of this, right? The NIH discussed this in '92. This was when they discussed it back in the '80s, but the NIH Revitalization Act started in '92, passed in '94, is what really allowed federal funding for this to occur over the last couple of decades. And then you get this state follow-up. I mean, now it's just come up to the high profile again because of these videos, because of a political agenda, at least in my view. One strategy is to wait it out, to counter individual efforts at the state level, and there's lots of groups that are really successful at influencing legislative debates. Is there an overarching strategy? Is education the right answer here? I'm not super optimistic there. I mean, I think there is some value for, as we talked about before, education of the specific rules under which tissue could be donated and on the uses of this tissue. But is that going to change minds if you're fundamentally opposed to the termination of a pregnancy? Probably not.
So we're about out of time here, so I wanted to close by looping today's ethics discussion with the one yesterday on genome editing of the germline. And I think the mentioning of Dolly is the perfect way to do it, because in the bottom line in yesterday's germline editing, we got back to the issue that, you've got to allow science to move slowly the way science normally does and answer some questions first. Dolly the sheep shows that going slow was a good thing. She led a much shorter life than normal, with a lot more ills than normal because the genetics wasn't quite right. So we learned from Dolly that going slow on that issue may have been an okay thing. So I think that all these issues, if we can avoid knee-jerk responses in our state houses, we can hopefully let the science work out some of the kinks in these things. So I want to thank you all for joining us today, and help me thank our three panelists.